Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 cards that should be added to the Hall of Fame format. Now, if you're not familiar with the Hall of Fame that was just recently announced by Blizzard, essentially they're taking 6 classic set cards, and they're going to be adding them into the Hall of Fame, which essentially means they're taking them out of standard format and putting them exclusively in wild format. Now, the cards on that list were things like Sylvanas Windrunner, Ragnaros the Firelord, Azure Drake, Power Overwhelming, Ice Lance, and Conceal. Now, I think some of those were good choices, namely Power Overwhelming, Ice Lance, and Conceal. They're all really cheap cards that can do sort of gimmicky things or do things that are just too powerful for their cost with burst damage in mind. In particular, each of those can set up some pretty crazy kinds of unavoidable burst damage, and I think that's a little fun personally, but I can understand why Blizzard thinks that's unhealthy for the game. Now, as far as Sylvanas, Rag, and Azure Drake are concerned, I'm not quite as in love with those decisions. I don't feel like any of those 3 cards feel particularly unfair. Now, the logic is that they're played in too many decks. They're just really, really popular and powerful cards at their mana slot. I don't think that's a design problem inherent to the cards, so much as just a failing of Blizzard to create other compelling competitive cards in those mana slots. So I think it'd be a better strategy to tackle the problem of these cards being too prominent, just to create other cards to compete with them, as opposed to just taking cards that people know and love, particularly cards that are popular from a Warcraft lore perspective with major characters like Sylvanas and Rag, and just tucking them away into wild format. That feels like a little bit of a cop-out or design failure, and I'm sad to see them go, but I do have 5 other cards I think would be a better fit for the Hall of Fame. In other words, 5 other cards that would probably fit better in wild format, are probably more destructive as far as the game is concerned, cards that feel worse to play against, and certainly cards that do gimmicky or sort of unfair type things. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into my list in no particular order. These are the 5 cards that really actually belong in the Hall of Fame. Up first is Leroy Jenkins, and I think really the problems with Ice Lance and Power Overwhelming and Conceal are that they set up so much burst damage, and that was properly identified by Blizzard, but I think they failed to address the fact that the card, which is at the root of a lot of the burst damage concerns, is right here. It's Leroy Jenkins. Now, they have nerfed him in the past, increasing his cost, which helped a little bit, but he has still remained the go-to instant charge burst damage minion in the game, and functionally he's the highest damage charge minion in the game. There is stuff like King Crush, I understand, but King Crush is too expensive to combo out with other pieces, and that's really where Leroy Jenkins tends to shine. So the fact that he's costed in a way that's balanced out by the whelps that he summons is irrelevant, because those whelps hardly ever actually see functional play, because Leroy is only used to end the game. So that downside that he has isn't really a downside at all, so you get a cheap, high damage charging minion. So I think tackling the issue of Leroy, whether it's by changing his design to make him a little bit more instantly punishing, whether it's moving him to the Hall of Fame, which is certainly the recommendation of this video, would be another step in the right direction for avoiding the burst meta that Blizzard seemingly hates so much. Now, that said, I don't actually hate burst style play or combo style play nearly as much as Blizzard, but if you're going to follow that line of thinking, if that is the goal you're trying to achieve, I think you have to start with Leroy Jenkins. So why not take the game's ultimate charge combo foundational piece and move him to Hall of Fame instead of a more harmless, slower card like Sylvanas, which isn't really something that feels terrible to lose to, and frankly doesn't lose games for people immediately, while on the other hand, Leroy Jenkins certainly can hit you in the face and steal a game that you thought you otherwise had won. Up next, you're probably detecting a theme. This is Malygos, another card which can set up ridiculous burst damage combos. Now, I personally do enjoy that style of play where you just wait it out, and then kill your opponent. For high skill games, I think that's a rewarding way to play Hearthstone. but it can certainly be frustrating for people who feel like they're ahead in a game, winning the game, and your opponent just does something crazy, and suddenly you're dead because you've taken so much damage from a Malygos combo. That's particularly bad because it limits the design space of future cards for Blizzard. Since Malygos will always be in the classic set unless it's moved to Hall of Fame, which would be my recommendation here, obviously, you can't do things like create really cheap spells that have high damage. It removes the amount of options. You can't do as much with mana, like with Innervate and Prep and those kinds of cards, because if you do, maybe you can do way more crazy Malygos combo plays. So not only is this card frustrating to lose to when it provides instant burst damage, but I think it restricts what Blizzard can actually accomplish in the future, and that's a problematic combination that could very easily be solved by simply moving Malygos into the Hall of Fame, opening up a lot more doors for the future, but still allowing people who love this kind of card and this kind of play the option to play with him in Wild and do some fun, crazy stuff. Now, this one might actually surprise some people because I don't think a lot of people think Faceless Manipulator is a particularly oppressive card, or it's not ruining the game. It's not a card you even see all that often, but it can do crazy things, and much like Malygos, it can restrict the options that Blizzard has in the future to design cards. Since this creates a copy of a minion, it can be really powerful when it copies stuff like a Ragnaros or Tyrian Fordring. And essentially you're getting two legendaries when the game is very specifically designed to often allow you to only have one of a given legendary. Now, thus far, that hasn't really been a problem outside from just a really high value 5 mana card. Getting a 5 mana Tyrian Fordring is nuts, right? But in the future, that could be an issue. What if there's a legendary that does something really specific and really awesome when it's on the board, and having Faceless Manipulator in the game prevents Blizzard from designing that legendary? I don't have a specific example or a suggestion for what that could be, but you can just imagine scenarios where that becomes a problem. Another issue with Faceless Manipulator, of course, is that with Leroy Jenkins, it has done some crazy stuff with burst damage. We've all played Reno Locks, where they get a discounted combo with Leroy Jenkins, Power Overwhelming, into Faceless Manipulator. Now, clearly, two of those cards in my suggestion would have already been moved to Hall of Fame format, leaving Faceless Manipulator a little bit less problematic. But of course, there are other charging minions in the game, and if charge is a mechanic, a keyword that exists, then Faceless Manipulator is going to always be able to double the value of that charge just in the way it works. So any instant effects on board like that, Faceless Manipulator makes a lot scarier. So it seems like this card just, again, restricts design space, creates potential problems, and even though it's a fun, interesting, quirky card as a part of the classic set, I think if it's around forever, it's just going to be too problematic in the long run. Up next is another one of the dragon aspects, but this time it's Alexstrasza. Now, I've said many times before how much I absolutely adore this card. It was the first legendary I ever had, and I played it a ton, but it's another one of those cards that just feels like it's so unfair when it comes down because its effect is so stupidly strong. It's essentially a burst damage card, and then it can do up to 15 damage. It's also a burst heal card from time to time, so that big heal can be equally frustrating. So since so much instant value is packed into this card, and it has set up crazy stuff like Freeze Mage in the past, which clearly Blizzard doesn't like, because that's why they're nerfing Ice Lance, as Freeze Mage has been just too popular of a deck historically. You can see why Alexstrasza is equally problematic, not just in Freeze Mage, but any other deck that's looking to move an opponent down to 15. We've seen it in stuff like Combo Druid in the past too. It's just that card that if it's there, it limits the kinds of options that Blizzard can do with burst damage and other cards that might synergize with it. So Alexstrasza seems problematic, even though it's not a card that's played in many decks, or frankly any decks currently on the ladder. This is another one of those cards that just feels bad to lose to. It feels troublesome to see played. And unlike Sylvanas or Ragnaros, which you feel like you can counter or prevent or have answers to, sometimes Alexstrasza just leaves you in a spot where you're just hopeless, and that's not a fun way to play Hearthstone necessarily. So yet another card that I think might just be a little bit healthier in the Hall of Fame. And up next, it's a card that I actually can't believe survived the Hall of Fame transition this time around. It was actually mentioned when Blizzard described why they were moving Conceal to the Hall of Fame. They name-dropped Gadgetzan Auctioneer as a possible card they considered adding to the Hall of Fame. And I think it would have been a good choice, too. I think Conceal actually still belongs in the Hall of Fame, but Gadgetzan Auctioneer should have gone with it. This is the kind of card that's just so downright powerful as a card draw engine. It can do absolutely ridiculous things because it's theoretically infinite in its value, and there's just not much counterplay available to opponents. Even if it's the kind of card that they have to spend 6 mana on, it used to be 5 mana, which was even more ridiculous. But there's still 4 mana to play with mana acceleration like Innervate Prep, of course. That can go even farther with all the counterfeit coins and coins that we see in Miracle Rogue. It feels like a rogue can draw through virtually their entire deck on a single Gadgetzan auctioneer with virtually no mana available. And that's, although cool to watch and cool to pull off as a Miracle Rogue player, it's so non-interactive and so frustrating to see when that happens against you and you just don't have a way to deal with it or answer it or comprehend it even. That's not a healthy or fun way to play Hearthstone. And in the past, this was a card that was almost exclusive to Miracle Rogue, and it felt like since it was just available to one deck, it wasn't necessarily that problematic. But then things like Jade Druid arrived, and this gets even scarier with Jade Druid value, where there's so many cheap 1-mana spells and they just keep generating forever and forever, that it gives Jade Druid that engine it needs to just absolutely dominate the late game. So that's equally scary, and you can see how that will just spin out of control with future cards and future releases. So as long as Gadgetzan Auctioneer is in standard format, I just feel like there's a lot of things Blizzard can't do with future card design. So since it's non-interactive, since it's frustrating, since it limits design, those are essentially the big 3 issues I have with cards being in Classic and being in standard format forever. So why don't we just go ahead and move Gadgetzan Auctioneer into the Hall of Fame and solve all of those problems. And there you have it. Those are my 5 cards I think belong in the Hall of Fame. It doesn't mean I hate the cards. It doesn't mean I don't like the cards. It just means I think Hearthstone might just be a little bit better off if they weren't in standard format for the future of all time, right? Now, I should say there are a few other cards I considered for this list. In fact, there are a few on the screen behind me in Mana Worm and Ice Block. I also thought about stuff like Divine Favor and a few other legendaries and cards here and there. But ultimately, those were the 5 that I thought were the most destructive to the game. Not necessarily problematic today on the ranked ladder, but have had some historical precedence of being destructive and frustrating. I think the game would be better off if they weren't around absolutely forever. So I'm sure you guys have some thoughts, comments, and questions about this list, and I'm sure you'd like to recommend some cards that you would prefer if they were moved to wild format. So leave those comments below. I'll be happy to read them all. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.